Today we want to go over just a few of the rules related to apostrophes and their use for showing possession of something. So you've got a noun that possesses something else and you want to show possession. Sometimes it can be confusing to know where exactly to put that apostrophe. Before the S, after the S, to add an extra S. And so we just want to go over not all the rules related to the use of apostrophes, but just a few of the select ones. And I've got them on the board here behind me, so we're going to go over those briefly. Once again, apostrophes related to possession, not apostrophes in contractions or things like this, but to show possession. If there is a plural noun that ends in S, the apostrophe comes at the end, and there's no need to add an extra S. So when we think of the plural noun students, meaning more than one, and we want to talk about something that belongs collectively to the students, like their hats, the way you would write it is the students, apostrophe, hats. You would not include an extra S. It wouldn't be the students, apostrophe S, students' hats. It would just be the students' hats. Next, then, you have a plural noun that does not end in S. In this case, the apostrophe comes after the word, and then you do add an S. So in this case, the plural for man is men, and you want to talk about the men's meeting. So you put the word men, apostrophe, S, and meeting. So in the first one, it's a plural noun that ends in S. You just put the apostrophe and you're done. And the second one, the plural does not end in S, so you add the apostrophe, then the S, and what's possessed. And then finally, if you've got a singular noun that ends you've got a singular noun, it ends with the apostrophe S, basically. So a singular noun, like our first one up here, we had a plural noun. The singular of students is student, and we want to talk about one student's hat. Then we put the word student, apostrophe S, hat. So it mimics this rule here, number 2. So a singular noun, you end with apostrophe S, the student's hat. For names that end in S, proper names, things like that, you don't have to add another S at the end, but it is customary to do so. So when you talk about the Joneses' house or Texas's weather, the way you do it is the word Texas, apostrophe S, weather. Now it would be fine, it would be acceptable if you just put Texas, apostrophe, weather, and people would know it means Texas's weather. And the same with Jones. The Joneses' house, you would put Jones, apostrophe S, or you could put Jones and then apostrophe. Either would be acceptable, so it's not required to put the extra S, but it is customary. Now, you never use an apostrophe when you're just talking about like the Joneses themselves in the plural. The Joneses went to Africa. In that case, you put Jones and then ES. You don't put an apostrophe there at all. But anyway, in terms of apostrophes and possession, just to review and hopefully make it clear, if it's a plural noun that ends in S, all you do is put the apostrophe on the end. Students, hats. If it's a plural noun that does not end in S, then you put an apostrophe S, men's meeting, mice's feet. If it's a singular noun, then you just put the noun apostrophe S to show possession. With formal things like Jones and Texas, just an apostrophe at the end is fine, but if you put an apostrophe S, that would actually be more customary. I hope this has been clear. If not, or you'd like to learn more about this, then underneath this video, if you look right beneath the video, there's a link there. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has related information to this, more information about things related to this. And also on that website, you'll find a link there to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
An independent clause contains a subject and a verb, and it's a complete thought. So an independent clause can stand by itself, so it can be a sentence. Like the sentence, I am running. See here we have a subject, I, and then we have this verb phrase, am, and running. And so it's a complete thought. It can stand alone and be a sentence. Now sometimes independent clauses have other clauses grouped with them, but they can also stand alone. Now a dependent clause also contains a subject and verb. However, it is an incomplete thought. And so we can take this independent clause up here and just add the word because to it, and it becomes a dependent clause. Because I am running still has a subject and a verb, but now we have the word because, and so it's a dependent clause. It's not a complete thought. You can't just say because I am running. You need something to go with it, like because I am running, I can't come to the meeting. And so that would be a complete sentence. So that's what a dependent clause is. Now, a noun clause can be a subject, a direct object, which I will abbreviate DO, an indirect object, abbreviated IO, or an object of a preposition. So a noun clause can begin with WH question words like what, which, when, where, who, or whom, and question words like how or if. Now, an adjective clause modifies a noun or pronoun. So an adjective clause begins with a word like who, whom, which, that, whose, when, where, why. And it's going to follow the word it modifies. Then finally we have an adverb clause, which modifies a verb, an adjective, another adverb, or an object of a preposition. Now, an adverb clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, such as after, because, since, unless, etc. And an adverb clause answers the question when, where, why, how, or to what degree, or under what condition. So that's a look at some different types of clauses. Conjunctions join words, phrases, and clauses, showing the relationship between them. So conjunctions join words, phrases, and clauses, and in addition, they show the relationship between these words, phrases, and clauses. And so there's some categories of conjunctions, including coordinating, correlative, and subordinating. And then there's conjunctive adverbs or transition words, which are another type of conjunction. But right now, we just want to focus on two of the main types of conjunctions, which are coordinating and correlative. And so these have similar definitions. The first is that they join grammatically equal words, phrases, or clauses. And so when we're talking about words, phrases, or clauses, we can be talking about two pronouns, two prepositional phrases, or two independent clauses, etc. And so those pronouns, prepositional phrases, or independent clauses are just being joined by coordinating conjunctions. And some examples of coordinating conjunctions are and, but, or, as well as nor. And then we have correlative conjunctions, which are used in pairs to join two or more words, phrases, or clauses that are grammatically equal. So you may be thinking that this is the same definition as we just looked at. Well, we still are talking about grammatically equal words, phrases, or clauses. But this time, we're talking about them being used in pairs. So some examples of correlative conjunctions are both paired with and, not only, paired with but also, and then either paired with or. So notice each time I have 3 dots in between the two conjunctions. And so what that is signifying is that you have a conjunction, then you have words in between, and then another conjunction. And so when we talk about joining 2 or more words, phrases, or clauses, again, we can be talking about pronouns, prepositional phrases, independent clauses. So say, for example, you have 2 independent clauses. You could say both, then you put 1 independent clauses, and then you put and write another independent clause. And so you're using these conjunctions to join these 2 phrases, clauses, or words together. Words must be spelled correctly. so that the reader can properly understand what the author is saying. So this first sentence says she has a pet Karani. Now we don't know what a Karani is, so we're somewhat confused as to the meaning of this sentence. Now after we look at this word for a little bit, we can realize that the author was trying to spell the word canary. And they just switched the R and the N. But some readers may have never figured that out, and so they would have no idea what the author was trying to say here, and they would just have to skip over this sentence. The second sentence says he went over there. Now, this sentence is pronounced correctly. However, the word they were looking for here is T-H-E-R-E. It's two different words here. They're spelled differently and they have different meanings. So it's important to use the right word. Now, even though the reader would figure out what the author is trying to say, readers tend to focus on mistakes that writers make. So the reader may be able to figure out what this sentence means, and they may be able to gain information from this sentence, but they're going to be focusing on the mistake that the writer made. And the third sentence says he drove the cat to work. So all of these words are spelled correctly, but the sentence doesn't make sense because how do you drive your cat to work? Well, the problem here is that the author accidentally wrote a T when they meant to write an R. So the word they were trying to use is car. And so you need to pay attention to this type of thing because you may read over this sentence and notice that all the words are spelled correctly, but actually you misspelled a word, and it so happened that when you misspelled it, you wrote a different word. So it's very important to always check your work and make sure that everything is spelled correctly.
There are two primary uses for the semicolon in the English language. The first is to separate two closely related independent clauses within a sentence. If you use a semicolon, there's no need to include a coordinating conjunction such as and. The second use for a semicolon is to separate items in a list when the items are long and complicated or contain internal punctuation such as a comma. Ordinarily, you would use a comma to separate items in a list, but if the items contain commas within them, it may be confusing to separate the items with a comma. So that's where the semicolon comes in. Here we have one example sentence for each usage. In this first one, we have two independent clauses separated by a semicolon. So each of these clauses could stand on its own as a sentence, but we've chosen to combine them into a single sentence, and we do so with a semicolon. It's proper to use a semicolon in this sentence because the two phrases, I went to the doctor and he told me I had the flu, are very closely related to one another. Hearing that you have the flu is a direct result of going to the doctor. You would not, for instance, be able to use a semicolon in a situation where your two clauses were, I went to the doctor, I scored a 99 on my exam, because they're not related in the same way that these are. So in order to use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses, the two clauses must be very closely related to one another. The second example was items in a list. So as you can see here, we've got three items, and they are city-state combinations. So you'll recall the proper way to list out cities and states is city, comma, state. So each item has an internal comma. So it could be confusing to try to separate them with commas. So the proper usage in this instance is to use a semicolon to separate each of them. So these are the two primary uses for semicolons in English.
Adverbs make writing clearer and more interesting. So an adverb describes another word. And so it can describe three different parts of speech. So it can describe a verb, an adjective, or even another adverb. And so an adverb completes one of four tasks. It can either tell how, when, where, or to what extent. So an adverb is going to describe a verb, an adjective, an adverb, and it's going to tell how, or when, or where, or to what extent. So I have three sentences right here, each with an adverb, so we're going to take a look at those. So this first one says, Mandy drove slowly. So we see an adverb right here of slowly. It ends in ly. And so a good way to find an adverb is by looking for a word that has the suffix of ly. Now, not all adverbs end in ly, and not all ly words are adverbs. So you still have to use your brain and look specifically at the word, but that's a good way to identify adverbs. So we have the adverb slowly, and it's describing drove. And so drove is a verb. And so slowly is describing drove. It's telling the reader how Mandy was driving, slowly. Now in this sentence, we see he drove really fast. And so here we find another ly word, really. Now really isn't describing drove. We're not saying he really drove. We're saying he drove really fast. So really is describing fast. So I'm going to circle fast, and in this case fast is an adjective. So in this sentence, adverb really describes the adjective fast. So it's telling the reader how quickly he drove. Now this last sentence says we like to cook out quite often. So we see two adverbs here, neither of which ends in ly, quite and often. So in this case, we're going to look at this adverb quite, and quite is describing often. So it's describing another adverb. So here we've seen three examples of three different adverbs, one describing a verb, one describing an adjective, and one describing another adverb. It is important to capitalize certain words according to grammar rules. Because when you don't follow grammar rules and you capitalize a word you shouldn't, or you don't capitalize a word that you should, it becomes distracting to the reader because they may know that specific grammar rule. And capitalizing certain words helps the reader follow along with your train of thought because it may help them realize when a sentence is beginning or when you're talking about a person's name. So we're going to look at this passage and identify the capitalization errors. So starting out, we're looking good. Then we go to the word January, and we see the J right there. The J is small, and it should be big. So that's one thing we should capitalize, months. Then we continue on to which was a Friday, and we find that the F isn't capitalized. So I'm going to write days. So you don't capitalize the word days, and you don't capitalize the word months, but you do capitalize months of the year, like January, February, December. You capitalize days of the week, like Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then it says we went to the Museum of Science on a class trip. So museum and science both need to be capitalized because this is a specific place. You don't capitalize of because it's not an important word. So you need to capitalize museum and science. And then notice right here, class does not need to be capitalized because there's no reason why it needs to be capitalized. Now we go to this sentence, and the is not capitalized, even though it's the first letter of the first word of a sentence. So we need to capitalize the first word of a sentence. The class took a bus to the museum. Now you may be thinking that museum needs to be capitalized here as well because we capitalize it over here. But here we're talking about the Museum of Science. It's a specific museum. Here we're just talking about a museum in general, so it's not capitalized. It was a lot of fun. That sentence looks good. My teacher, Mrs. Jones, and some parents came with us. Now the first word of the sentence is capitalized, which is good. Jones is capitalized, which is the last name. We always capitalize last names. But then Mrs. isn't capitalized. And so you need to capitalize abbreviations before names. Abbreviations before names. And so those can be things like Dr., Mr., Ms., Mrs. All those abbreviations need to be capitalized. And so those are some examples of words that do need to be capitalized, but there are many other grammar rules out there, but those are some common words that are accidentally capitalized or accidentally not capitalized. Today we're going to talk about commas. Now commas have three main functions: to separate clauses, to join independent clauses, and to avoid confusion. So let's take a look at the first use, to separate clauses. This is when you need to separate a dependent clause from an independent clause, as is the case with this sentence. Michael went to the beach after he got ice cream. Michael went to the beach is the independent clause, and after he got ice cream is the dependent clause. Now, to test whether a clause is a dependent clause is just read that clause by itself. So if we were to read after he got ice cream, we would realize that's a dependent clause. It's dependent on the independent clause to make sense. Because if I just say after he got ice cream, that doesn't make very much sense. You're thinking, okay, what happened after he got ice cream? So Michael went to the beach is the independent clause because it can stand by itself, and after he got ice cream is the dependent clause. Now, dependent clauses can actually come before or after an independent clause. In fact, they can actually come inside the independent clause as well. So we could reverse this sentence and we could say, after he got ice cream, Michael went to the beach. There again, after he got ice cream is still the dependent clause, and Michael went to the beach is still the independent clause. The sentence is just constructed differently. Now, a second use for commas is to join independent clauses. This is when basically you have two sentences that are closely related and you want to join them together. So if we were to say Taylor plays basketball, and then we also had another sentence, he enjoys running, we can easily join those two together. There's a couple ways to do that, but one of the ways is to use a comma and a conjunction. So we can say Taylor plays basketball, comma, and he enjoys running. The comma helps bring these two sentences together, and it helps you realize what's happening, that you're adding two sentences together. Now, the third use is to avoid confusion. There's a couple times when you want to do this. First would be when you're putting words in a list or items in a list. So if I were to say, I got a baseball, bike, and trampoline, I need commas to separate all three of the items. Now, sometimes you can leave the second comma off, and that can be fine as well. But you need at least one comma in here so people realize that it's a list. Because if I don't have a comma right here, it just looks like I got a baseball bike, and people are trying to figure out what is a baseball bike. Now, most people can pretty much figure out what you're trying to say, but a comma right there makes it so much easier for the reader because they can easily look at this and think, okay, you got a baseball, a bike, and a trampoline. Now, another time that you need a comma to avoid confusion is when someone just reading the sentence could easily get it mixed up, okay? So if I were to say, after we ate, our dad left for work, okay? So with the comma in here, it's easy to read that. After we ate, our dad went to work. The family was eating, they got finished, and the dad left for work, okay? But if the comma's not there, it can make it kind of confusing. The first time someone reads this, they're gonna think, after we ate, our dad left for work. And so they're thinking, wait, they ate their dad? No, of course not. And a reader eventually, yes, is probably going to figure out what the person's trying to convey that wrote the sentence. But it makes it so much easier if you have a comma right here because it makes it so much easier for the reader to understand what's going on. And sometimes, in certain cases, if a writer leaves out a comma, it can make it very hard, almost impossible, for the reader to try to understand what the writer was trying to convey. And as a writer, anytime you're writing something, you want to convey things in such a way that people can easily read them and pick up what you're trying to convey. All right? So then again, commas, three main uses: to separate clauses, to join independent clauses, and to avoid confusion.
Fragments and run-on sentences. A fragment is an incomplete sentence or thought that cannot stand on its own. And it can't stand on its own and is incomplete because it's missing either a noun or a verb. So let's look at some examples of fragments. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard. Now this is a lot of information. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard. But you have your noun, some adjectives to describe it, an article adjective, and then you've got a prepositional phrase that tells you where they are. But you're missing something. You're missing the verb. So this one is a fragment. So you can have a longer sentence or a longer fragment that looks like a sentence and still have it be a fragment because it's missing either the noun or the verb. So we had our noun, but we were missing our verb. So even though it looks long and looks like it could be a sentence, don't be fooled by the length of a fragment, because just because a phrase is long doesn't mean it's a complete sentence. Let's look at another example. Waited all day at my house for you. In this sentence, we have an action, waiting, so we've got our verb. All day at my house for you. Well, you see some pronouns in there, but there's no noun. There's no subject of this sentence, so you're missing a subject noun in this one. So it's still a fragment. You've got the verb part, you've got the predicate part of your sentence, but you don't have the subject part. So this is a fragment. It is not a complete sentence. So when you're looking for fragments, look for either a missing verb or missing noun, because if you're missing one of those, then your fragment cannot stand on its own and will not be a complete sentence. In your writing, you'll need to revise this, you need to revise these, and often you can just add a little bit to a fragment to make it a complete sentence. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard look so nice this time of year. Smell wonderful. Are going to win the contest. You can finish the sentence in any way. Waited all day at my house for you. You could say, we waited all day at my house for you. I waited. My mom and I waited. It's a little bit more limited what you could put at the beginning of this sentence, because we've got my and you for pronouns down here, but you still have options, and you could easily turn this fragment into a complete sentence. Now let's look at run-on sentences. A run-on sentence is a sentence that should be written as two sentences. It's too long. It contains too much information and is confusing to the reader. And if it's running on and on and on, then it's likely there's not correct punctuation and there's too many nouns and too many verbs crammed into one sentence. So you need to break it up so that you've got separate complete thoughts and it's easier for the reader to understand. Let's look at these examples of run-on sentences and then correct them. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. This is a lot of information, so we need to see where one thought ends and another one starts so that we can split it up. I couldn't believe it. Well, we want to know what she couldn't believe. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. So all that is one thought. So we're going to separate this and put a period, and we would need to capitalize the next letter, but since it was I, it was automatically capitalized. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. Now we have two complete sentences. They're separate, it's not too much information in each sentence, and it's not going to be confusing to the reader. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. So now it's not so confusing. It doesn't just run on and on and on. We didn't have so many subjects and so many verbs in one sentence. Now we've separated it out and made it easier for the reader to understand right away. Let's look at our next example. John and Mary had so much fun they went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. Now this one, we need to find where we need to split it up. We have another run-on sentence. We've got a lot of actions, but we need to see where we could split it up to keep the subject and verb of one sentence and the subject and verb of a second sentence and make it two complete sentences. We don't want to split it up incorrectly and leave a fragment somewhere. John and Mary, let's look at what they did. John and Mary had so much fun, they. When we get to they, that's a new pronoun, that's a new subject, so we should stop there. John and Mary had so much fun. And then, if we're starting a new sentence, we need to capitalize our T in they. John and Mary had so much fun. They went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. So now we have two complete thoughts. First we're saying they had fun, and then we're saying how they had fun. And we didn't keep it a run-on sentence to where we had this pronoun in the middle of this sentence, making it sound a little confusing. We have John and Mary having fun, and then they went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. So we split it up into two sentences that are easier to understand. And you also would want to revise any run-on sentences in your writing. If you see a sentence that's going on and on for 3 or 4 lines, you probably need to find somewhere in there to break it up so that it isn't a run-on sentence. You can have sentences that are more complex if you're using semicolons, etc., but you don't want it to be so long that there are too many ideas in one sentence. So when you're writing, make sure you don't have any incomplete thoughts that are missing a noun or verb. We don't want any fragments in your writing, and make sure that none of your sentences are going on so long and including too much information that it makes it a run-on sentence.
Misplaced modifiers can be very confusing, and they can distort the accurate meaning of your sentence. So let's look at this example up here on the board. The teacher said that eating fruit is good for you in class. This is a case of a misplaced modifier. Now, another word for an adverb is a modifier. So I'm going to write up here on the board adverb equals modifier. Modifier is the same thing as an adverb. So when we're saying a misplaced modifier, we're actually saying misplaced adverb. Okay, so you're looking at this sentence thinking, where is the adverb? In class, collectively, is the adverb. This is what you call an adverbial phrase. It's a group of words that collectively takes the form of an adverb, or collectively does the job of an adverb. So adverbs often answer a question. In this case, the question is, where? The teacher said that eating fruit is good for you. Where did the teacher say that? They said, in class. So in class answers the question where. So it's an adverbial phrase. Now, the reason this is misplaced, a misplaced adverbial phrase, is because it appears to the reader that this phrase is modifying eating fruit is good for you. So it appears to the reader that the teacher is saying that to eat fruit in class is good. So it looks like the teacher is in favor of the students eating fruit while in the classroom. Now, that's not actually the case. The teacher is merely saying that eating fruit is good for you, but not while you were in class. So the better way to write this sentence would be, the teacher said in class that eating fruit is good for you. So in this case, in class is still the adverb, still the adverbial phrase, but since it's closer to what it's modifying, it makes more sense. So whenever you are writing, make sure that you put the adverb or the adverb clause or the adverbial phrase, whatever word or group of words that's modifying something in a sentence. Make sure that the modifier is very close to what it is modifying. Make sure the modifier is close to the modified. So right here, in class is the modifier, but it's modifying the teacher said, or it's modifying the verb said. But look how far away it is from the verb said. All these words are in between it and the word it's modifying. But when you put the adverb right next to the word that it's modifying, it makes it so much simpler for the reader to understand. Now the sentence can be read correctly and understood correctly. The teacher said in class that eating fruit is good for you. So remember, when you're writing, make sure that you don't misplace the modifier.
Parallelism. Parallelism means writing with a parallel structure. That means all nouns, verbs, and phrases should have the same structure. Let's look at some examples to see what that means. In example 1, John runs fast and plays hard. There we have multiple verbs, runs and plays. So they should be parallel. They should have the same structure. And both runs and plays are simple third person present tense verbs. So they are simple verbs. They don't have any suffixes. They're third person. We're talking about John. You're not saying I did this. You're saying John did this, talking about someone else. And it's present tense. He's running and playing right now. He runs and plays in the present. So they agree. Both runs and plays are simple third person present tense verbs. So they have parallel structure. So this one is good. Let's look at example 2. My hobbies are playing the piano, running marathons, and reading books. So we have 3 phrases there, but they all start with verbs. So let's look at those. Playing the piano, running marathons, reading books. This sentence also has correct verb structure. Playing, running, and reading are all present tense, and they all have ing as a suffix for them. If this sentence didn't have parallel verb structure, it would seem awkward and disjointed. Think about it. If it said, my hobbies are playing the piano, run marathons, and read books, it wouldn't make sense because you've got one with ing, one that's present tense, and one that's past tense. They all have to agree. They all have to have the same structure. They need to be the same tense. They need to be the same, have the same suffix, or all not have a suffix. And all these things are important whenever you're writing a sentence that is more complex than just something with one subject or one noun and one verb. If you have multiple nouns, verbs, or phrases, you need to make sure they have parallel structure. So again, this one was good, but if it wasn't, it wouldn't sound very good. It would sound awkward and disjointed. Let's look at example 3. When we went to the beach, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and we took walks on the beach. This one was another one with 3 verb phrases. When we went to the beach, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and we took walks along the beach. Swimming and building are both present tense with ing endings, but took is past tense. It does not have the ing, and it makes our sentence sound disjointed. So this one needs to be revised. So let's talk about some ways we can do that. We already have swimming and building, so we could make that last phrase agree with the first one. If we do that, we could say, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and taking walks along the beach. And that is one correct way to fix this. Now, that isn't the only way. Let's look at another way, because whenever you're trying to find parallel structure, you don't necessarily have to make it all match the first verb that you come to or the first noun that you come to. You just have to make them all have the same structure. So if we took them all out and we came up with a different way, we could say, when we went to the beach, we're going to take out even more of it to make this one make sense. When we went to the beach, we swam in the water, built sandcastles, and took walks along the beach. So in this one, instead of leaving the first 2 in the present tense with ing suffix, we changed them all to match that last verb, which was past tense. But we took out having we here because we already had we at the beginning. We didn't need to keep repeating we. We could just make the phrases go after it and have parallel structure so that they made sense. So another way to fix the sentence was to say, when we went to the beach, we swam in the water, built sandcastles, and took walks along the beach. So we changed them all to past tense, and now they match and have parallel structure. So now we've revised it, and it's good. So whenever you're writing, make sure that your writing has parallelism. You want to make sure that all the nouns, verbs, or phrases have the same structure so that your writing makes sense and doesn't sound awkward or disjointed.
Making words plural can sometimes be difficult because words are made into a plural form in many different ways. So I want to look at some examples of words that are plural so that you can be comfortable making singular words plural. So up here we have the words chair and towel made into a plural form by just adding an S to the end. So they become chairs and towels. This is the most basic way to make a word plural. Most words can be made plural by just adding an S to the end. However, there are some words that are a little more tricky, and I want to take a look at some of those. So any word that ends in CH, X, S, or any sound that sounds like S, you just add ES to the end of that word to make it plural. So right here we have the word rash, and SH makes an S sound, so we just add ES to the end of rash to make it plural, rashes. Here we have the word fox, which ends in X, so we add ES to the end to make it foxes, and so it's plural. Here we have the word stitch, which ends in CH, and we just add ES to the end to make it plural. Then finally we have the word gas, and gas ends in S, so again we just add ES to the end to make it plural. Up here we have the word deer, and deer is kind of an irregular word because most words you do something to them to make them plural. However, the word deer is both singular and plural. So I could say, I saw a deer in the meadow, or I saw many deer in the meadow. However, the word deer still always remains the same. So that's an irregular word right there. And so you need to have those kind of words memorized so that you know not to add an S to the end of them to make them plural. Here are some more irregular words. We have geese and mice. So these words were goose and mouse. So to make goose plural, we change both O's to E's. And to make mouse plural, we pretty much changed up the whole word. We changed up the whole word to make it mice. So again, these are irregular words, and you just kind of have to have these words memorized because there's no set rules of how to make these words plural. You just kind of have to know how in the English language we are going to make these words plural. So the important thing to remember is that in most cases, you're just going to add an S to the end of the word to make it plural. And then in many other cases, you're going to add an ES to the end. And then just be mindful of these words that aren't quite so normal, that you have to take different means to make them plural.
Point of view. The point of view is the perspective from which a story is told. And the narrator is the person who tells the story. So when we're looking for point of view, we're looking to see if we have a first-person narrator or a third-person narrator that's telling us the story. In first person, your narrator is going to be your main character, and they're going to be saying I, me, we. These are the pronouns you're going to see associated with the first-person narrator. If it's the main character, you're only going to get to know what the main character knows. You're only going to get to read about what that main character does or what he does with someone else. But you won't know about anything that doesn't happen involving the main character because this is written from a first-person point of view and you're only going to hear from this viewpoint. Third person is the most common point of view. And you're going to see pronouns like he, she, and they. The narrator is going to talk about other characters, but the narrator is not one of the characters. And third person omniscient is very common as well. Omniscient means all-knowing. So a third person omniscient narrator is going to be one who describes all other characters. So at once. So this narrator is going to be able to tell you what every other character in the story is thinking, what every other character in the story is doing. Now they may not actually do it all in the same passage. Sometimes they split it into chapters. So one chapter is written to where the author is telling you everything that Johnny does. One chapter split will tell you everything that Susie does. So you find out everyone's point of view, but possibly at different times. But the author is able to do all of that without actually being a part of the story. So whenever you're looking for who your narrator is, the pronouns are the important thing to look at. Let's look at this passage. John walked to school every day. He and his friends were often cold and tired by the time they arrived. They were allowed to warm up by the stove before sitting in their seats. In this passage, let's look at the pronouns to help determine the point of view. And your pronouns are going to be words that take the place of nouns, such as I, me, we, he, she, they, it, you. But these are going to be the ones that are really going to set you off as markers to let you know if it's a first person or third person narrator that you're listening to. So looking through this, we have he and his friends. By the time they arrived, they were allowed to warm up by the stove before sitting in their seats. And it started with John. So the narrator is using he and they and someone's name. Now, first person could use someone's name, and that's why it's important to look at the pronouns. But the narrator starts talking about John, and then he uses all of these third person pronouns. The narrator is a third person narrator here. Oh, let's write it out. Third person. And you know this because you're looking at the pronouns. And the pronouns are all telling you that the narrator is telling you what's happening, but the narrator is not a part of the action. So the point of view is a third person point of view. So whenever you're going to find point of view, you want to know this because the perspective of the story, who it's coming from, is important. If it's coming from a certain character, or if it's coming from a first person or a third person point of view, then you're going to have a different plot or have information, more intimate information in first person and a greater variety of information with third person. So it's always important to determine your point of view whenever you are reading a story. So just keep in mind that the best way to find that is by looking at the pronouns. I, me, and we, he, she, and they. Prefixes, suffixes, and root words. Have you ever been reading a book and come across a word that you've never seen before? Well, if you can break that word down into prefixes, suffixes, and root words, then you can probably figure out what the word means. For instance, orthography may be a word you've never seen before. But if we break it down into its prefix, ortho, its root word, graph, and its suffix, y, then we might be able to figure out what the word means. Ortho means correct or straight. Graph means write or draw. And y means the state or condition of. So if we put all those together, we can get the state of being written correctly. And when we compare the definition we came up with our actual definition, you can see they're pretty close. The state of being written correctly, writing words using the proper letters. So you got a pretty good idea just by breaking the words down into a prefix, a root word, and a suffix and figuring out what those meant. And even if you only knew graph had something to do with writing, you would have an idea that orthography had to do something with writing. Let's look at another example. Geometric. We'll break down into our prefix, geo, our root word, metra, and our suffix, ik. Geo means earth, and we put that with metra, which means measure, and ik means having to do with. So if we put all of those together, we can come up with having to do with measuring the earth. Now this one isn't quite as close to the actual definition, relating to the branch of mathematics that has to do with measuring points, lines, and angles, but it does have measuring in there. You would be able to tell from the root word measure that geometric is going to have something to do with measuring. So if you ever come across a word that you don't know, first try to figure out what the prefix is, the root word is, and the suffix is, so that you can maybe get an idea of what the word means. You can see how important prefixes, suffixes, and root words are to understanding what a word means.
It's important to choose the correct pronoun when you're writing or when you're speaking. So we're going to take a look at a tip or a little trick to be able to determine which pronoun to use. So you're going to want to restate sentences twice using each subject individually. So when you want to use a pronoun, you can usually whittle it down to two pronouns that you're looking at that you're trying to decide between. So what you want to do is try the sentence twice, each time with a different pronoun, and determine which one sounds correctly. Ideally, you're going to want to be familiar with the correct grammar rules to be able to figure out which pronoun to use. But obviously, in this case, if you're trying to decide between them, you don't know the grammar rules, so you're going strictly off of sound. That's because you've heard other people use pronouns correctly. So you just plug in each of the pronouns, and you'll be able to determine which one sounds correct. So right here, we have Bob and blank will be going. So we need to figure out the correct pronoun. So it's either going to be me or I. So now we just need to try both. Like Bob and me will be going. Well, that doesn't sound very good, so let's try I. Bob and I will be going. So we know that's correct. Now here we need a pronoun as well. So it's either going to be we or us. So we can try this out. We boys played football last year, or us boys played football last year. Well, immediately we notice that boys doesn't sound correct here. In fact, we need to eliminate boys, because you never want to use a pronoun and its antecedent next to each other. Like, say, for example, we were talking about somebody named Tim. Tim would be the antecedent for the pronoun he. So say Tim went to the store. We could instead say he went to the store. So the pronoun he would be standing for Tim, which would be the antecedent. So here, boys is the antecedent for we or us. So we don't need to use a pronoun and its antecedent, so we just eliminate boys here. So now we just try both of these. So we could say, we played football last year. Well, that sounds correct, but let's go ahead and try us as well. Us played football last year. Well, that doesn't sound right, so the correct answer is going to be we. So that doesn't take very long, and you don't actually have to write it out. Sometimes if you're just about to speak it, you can figure it out in your head. You can go through this test in your head and determine which pronoun is correct. Quotation marks are used to show that the words inside the quotation marks are someone else's, not the writer's own. So look at this sentence. Come over here, Joe said. So the quotation marks right here and right here are conveying that the writer did not say come over here. Joe said come over here. So notice a few things about a sentence that has a quote in it. First, you open up the sentence with quotation marks. Then you capitalize the first letter of the first word inside the quotation marks. And then if you have a sentence that is declarative or imperative, any sentence that would end with a period if it was on its own, you end that sentence with a comma, then you have quotation marks, and then you say the rest of the sentence. So this sentence says, where did he go? Notice we open up with quotation marks, capitalize the W, but if where did he go stood by itself, it would have a question mark because it's a question. So we put a question mark right here and then close with the quotation marks. Notice that the question mark is included inside the quotation marks. It's not on the outside, it's on the inside. This sentence says, there he is, he exclaimed. So in this case, the person's saying it with a lot of emotion, so that's why we ended with an exclamation mark. Now these next couple sentences are kind of inverted from the sentences we've been looking at because the quote comes later in the sentence. So this sentence says, Michael said, I can't wait for dinner. So you put a comma after said, open up with quotation marks, go through the sentence, and then this sentence right here is declarative, so it ends with a period. And up here we ended with a comma, but here we're ending with a period because we've come to the end of the sentence and there needs to be some kind of period or question mark or exclamation mark to end out the sentence. So in this case, a period is chosen to end the sentence and then quotation marks are put at the end. Notice that the period is inside the quotation marks. This sentence says, Michael asked, "What's for dinner?" In this case, it's a question, so that's why we have a question mark at the end. Again, notice that it's inside the quotation marks. Now this final sentence is kind of unique. It says, "I think we were having burgers." Michael said, "Do you know what we are having?" So right here, there's two quotes within one sentence. So it says, "I think we were having burgers." So we open up with quotation marks. We have the quote right here. We end with a comma because this is a declarative sentence. And then we have another set of quotation marks. Then we have something outside of the quotes because we're saying that Michael said this. And then we continue on with what Michael said. So we open up with quotation marks. And it says, "Do you know what we are having?" This is a question, so we use a question mark. And then we end with quotation marks. So those are the important things you need to remember when using quotation marks.
Recursive writing process. The writer is constantly improving his or her work. While you're writing, you are going to constantly be trying to make that paper better that you're writing. The normal steps in the writing process are pre-writing, then writing or drafting, then editing, then proofreading, and finally presenting. Now you may not read your paper aloud, but when you present it to someone else to read, then that is the presentation stage. So in pre-writing, you're going to be doing all of your outlining, you're going to list any ideas you have, you're going to get as much information down as you can. Then in writing, you're going to be actually writing out complete sentences in paragraph form so that you can kind of decide how you want to arrange your paper. In editing, you can move paragraphs around if you felt like maybe your third paragraph should move to the first paragraph. However you wanted to do that, any sentences that you thought, oh, I could add some more to this, I could put more information here, I could take this out and put it in a different paragraph, any kind of revisions like that are in editing. In proofreading, you're looking for correct spelling, correct grammar, making sure that your sentences are punctuated correctly, you don't have any run-ons or fragments. And then presenting, again, is either saying, okay, I'm ready for you to read this, or reading it aloud, or if you wrote a play, having them act it out, or if you were writing a screenplay for a movie, having someone read that out. So the presentation stage is basically just saying, okay, what I wrote is complete, I'm ready for someone else to experience it. However, authors do not follow these steps exactly, because writing is a complex activity. When you are writing, you may be in the writing stage, writing out those paragraphs, writing complete sentences, getting everything organized the way you want, and you may catch a spelling mistake. But spelling mistakes are supposed to be caught and corrected in the proofreading stage. Now, why would you wait to correct the spelling mistake until later? If you catch it now, fix it now. And it's okay that you're doing it out of order. You will go through all of these stages during your writing process to make sure that you catch any problems that you've missed. But if you happen to see something you want to fix and you're in the writing stage, or you see a spelling mistake and you're in the editing stage, that's okay. Or if you're already back here in proofreading and you say, the more I read this, I really think that I should move paragraph 3 up to paragraph 2 and 2 down to 3. I really think they'd be better if I reversed the order. You can still do that even though you're not in the editing stage anymore. That's fine. If you're in pre-writing and you're already writing sentences, that's fine too. Writing is complex and everyone's not going to go in the normal order of steps whenever they're writing. Now you do want to make sure that you go through each step because you don't want to miss something in your paper and present something that isn't 100% ready to be presented. So this is the recursive writing process. Recursive writing means generally following those normal steps. but improving the piece constantly. So the main goal is to improve your writing to make it the best that it can be. So you're going to be generally following the normal steps up here, but improving the piece constantly no matter what stage you are on. So if you are on writing and you need to do some proofreading, or if you're on proofreading and need to do some editing, it's okay to move around between the stages because writing is a complex activity. So when you're writing, don't think that you have to go in this order and you can't correct anything out of order or revise anything if you're past the revision stage. Make sure that you're always trying to make your writing the best it can be.
It is important to be an accurate speller in all of your writing because it helps the reader understand what you are trying to say. And oftentimes, if you spell something wrong, the reader will get distracted because they're going to be focusing on the misspelling instead of the thoughts and ideas you're trying to convey. So I've written a few tips up here on the board to help you remember how to spell some words correctly. So the first tip is I before E except after C. And that rhymes, so you can remember that easily. So if you look at the word relieve and you're wondering whether to put the I or the E first, just remember the I, and it says I before E except after C. There's no C before it, so I must come before E. The next word is conceit. There is a C right here, so in this case, E is going to come before I. Another tip is drop the E. So if you have the word dance and you're adding ing to the end, just drop the E from the end so that dance becomes dancing, D-A-N-C-I-N-G. And the final tip is change the Y to I. So if you have the word happy, it becomes happiness. Just change the Y right there to an I and add N-E-S-S. Now this does not apply if you're adding ing to the end of the word. So right here, study ends with a Y, but since you're adding ing, the Y remains. And then also, this rule does not apply if the Y is preceded by a vowel. So in the word relay, A comes right before I, so you just add ed into the end without changing the Y to the I. But as a general rule, you do change the Y to an I. So those are just a few of the spelling tips that are out there, but there are many more out there that you can study and remember to help you remember how to spell words correctly. A subject, along with a verb, completes a sentence. Every sentence must have a subject and a verb. So always be looking for the subject in a sentence because it has to be there somewhere. Look at this first example. Running is good for you. The verb right here is. So then what is the subject of this sentence? Well, the way you can find the subject is it's the person or thing that's doing the action in the sentence. So what is in this sentence? Running is. So running would be the subject. Okay, so think of another example, like he rode his bike. Okay, rode is the verb here. So again, you can just ask the question, who is riding here? Who is the person or the thing doing the action here? Well, the action is riding, so then who is riding? He is riding, so he would be the subject. Over here, she is cheerful. Okay, who is cheerful? She is cheerful, so she would be the subject. Now this is going to get a little bit more complicated now. She is cheerful, but her friend looks sad. So right here you see a verb, and then, okay, who is cheerful? She is cheerful. She is the one doing the action in the sentence, and that's being cheerful. So she is the subject. Now you look down here and you see another verb, looks. So what's the subject over here? Can there be two subjects in a sentence? There can. Because notice right here, but. But is what we call a conjunction because it joins two clauses together. So we have a sentence here and a sentence here, and but is joining them together to make them one. But if we have a sentence here and a sentence here being joined together by but, that means we must have two subjects and two verbs. So we found one subject and one verb, and then we found the other verb, so we're still looking for a subject. So what could the subject be? Could it be her looks sad? That wouldn't make sense, because remember, the subject is who or what is doing the action. So someone is looking sad in this sentence. Who is looking sad? the friend is looking sad, so friend is the subject over here. All right, like I said, every sentence has a subject and a verb, but you may come across some sentences like this. This sentence says, go to your room. So the verb here is go. So where is the subject in this sentence? Well, the subject is what we call an understood you. So we're going to put you in parentheses right there. So I say it's an understood you. Basically, it's understood that you is the subject of this sentence, so it doesn't even need to be included. So we could actually read this sentence as, you go to your room. But we don't always speak like that. Sometimes we leave the you out of the sentence, so we just have a verb. But nevertheless, there still is a subject. It's just not included in the sentence. Subordinating conjunctions are words or group of words that make one part of the sentence dependent on the rest of the sentence. Take a look at what I mean. This sentence says the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. As long as is the subordinating conjunction in this sentence. Now, the organization will exist could be a sentence by itself. You put a period right there. And there is ample funding could also be a sentence by itself. Those two sentences could stand alone. But when we add to this first sentence, the organization will exist as long as, it makes the rest of the sentence, or it makes that sentence dependent on something else. Because if we were just to say the organization will exist as long as, that leaves us hanging. That's a fragment. It needs some other words to go along with it to make it a complete sentence. So the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. So as long as is the subordinating conjunction, making the first part of the sentence dependent on something else to complete the sentence. Let's look at one more example. Since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Since right here is the subordinating conjunction. Remember, I said a subordinating conjunction can be one word or a group of words. So up here, it was 3 words. Sometimes the subordinating conjunction is 2 words, and then often it is just 1 word, like since. So here it says, since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Now again, let's eat lunch could be a sentence by itself, and it is noon could be a sentence by itself. But when we add since to it is noon, it makes this part of the sentence dependent on some other words to complete the sentence. Because if we just said, since it is noon, that wouldn't make any sense. That would be a fragment because it's incomplete. So a subordinating conjunction makes the rest of the sentence dependent on something else to complete it. That way, since it is noon, let's eat lunch makes sense. Transitions are very helpful to the reader because they help the reader transition from one thought to another or one concept to another. Transitions can be placed at the beginning of a sentence or in the middle of a sentence, either to help the reader transition from one sentence to another or from one part of the sentence to another part of the sentence. So I want to take a look at many different kinds of transition words and phrases that can be used and how they can be used accurately in sentences. So first of all, transitions can be broken up into different kinds of transitions. So some transitions show addition, like the transitions next and in addition. Remember I said that we can also have transition phrases, and so this is a prepositional phrase acting as a transition. Another type of transition is a summary, like in conclusion or finally. And there's some transitions that show sequence, like later or then. And then finally, some transitions show contrast, like although or meanwhile. So how can you effectively use these transitions in sentences? Many times the transition word or transition phrase needs to go at the beginning of the sentence. Like here, this sentence says, next, bake the cookies for 10 minutes. So we put the transition at the beginning of the sentence and put a comma after it. Now, generally, commas come in pairs in sentences when they are showing that a certain part of the sentence isn't needed. So notice here that next could be removed from the sentence, and we could just read the sentence like this, bake the cookies for 10 minutes, and it would still make sense. So usually when you have some kind of phrase or word that could be omitted from the sentence, you put commas on both sides of it. Like here's part of a sentence, then there's a comma, here's the part of the sentence that isn't needed, another comma, and then the rest of the sentence. But when a word or phrase comes at the beginning or the end of a sentence, you only need one comma because you wouldn't put a comma before next. That would look funny. So you just put a comma after it to show that next isn't there. So although next isn't essential to the sentence, it's helpful because it helps the reader understand the transition from one thought to another. In this case, the next step and directions on how to bake cookies. All right, this next sentence says, although I enjoy the outdoors, I do not like to run. Although is a transition that shows contrast. And notice here there's not a comma right after although. It's placed after outdoors. But again, although I enjoy the outdoors could be removed from the sentence, and it would still make sense. It would just say, I do not like to run. Nevertheless, this part of the sentence is still important to the overall paper. Now, notice that in certain cases, you have to continue the sentence for it to make sense. Like here, it wouldn't matter whether next was here or not. But since you've put although right here, you have to finish the sentence. You couldn't say, although I enjoy the outdoors. Because I enjoy the outdoors makes sense by itself, but once you add although to it, you're telling the reader that there's something else that needs to come. So after you put, although I enjoy the outdoors, you have to put, I do not like to run to finish out the sentence. So the things that are important to remember from this session is that there are many different kinds of transitions that can be classified into different categories. And there's many more categories we could have listed and many more transitions we could have listed under each category. And then generally, the transition word or phrase is going to go at the beginning of the sentence. And in this case, where there's a phrase at the beginning of the sentence that is started off by a transition word, make sure you finish the sentence and don't leave the reader hanging by writing a fragment. What is an adjective? Through this session, I want to find the answer to that question. Now, I know you are probably familiar with the term adjective, but I want to look more specifically at what an adjective is and how it can be used. So let's take a look at this first example. I like that green car. Now, the general definition of an adjective is a word that describes or modifies another word in the sentence. So in order to identify the adjective in this sentence, we're looking for a word that is describing another word. So if we look through this sentence, we notice that green car is in this sentence. And you can quickly realize that green is the adjective in this sentence. Why? Because green can't stand alone in this sentence. Green must be modifying or describing car. It's saying, I like that car that is green. Green is describing what kind of car is there. Let's go on to another example. My mom makes delicious food. Again, we're looking for a word that is describing another word in the sentence. So if you were to read this sentence and stop right here, you would read the sentence as, my mom makes delicious. So we can quickly realize that delicious can't stand alone in this sentence. So delicious must be describing something else. So we can just look at the next word in the sentence, food. My mom makes delicious food. So delicious is obviously describing what kind of food is here. Now I said that delicious can't stand alone here, and I was right. I mean, if food is gone, it says mom makes delicious. That doesn't make any sense. Now that is not always the case with adjectives. Like in this sentence, if I said I like that green, and we left car out, and the sentence just said I like that green, it still makes sense because the reader or the speaker or the writer of this word could simply be talking about that they like a certain shade of green. But a lot of times you can find an adjective because it can't stand alone in the sentence. Let's take a look at this next example. How much income tax do you have to pay? Now, this adjective is not as easy to find as other adjectives we've been looking at. So let's look closely at this sentence. We're continuing through this sentence, just one word at a time. How much income tax? Now, if you stop right here, you realize that income is describing tax. A lot of times, an adjective answers a question, like who, what, wow, when. So in other words, we're saying, like, what kind of tax is here? It's an income tax. What kind of food is here? It's delicious food. What kind of car is it? It's a green car. So a lot of times if you look at a certain noun in a sentence and you ask, what kind is it? or asks some kind of question similar to that, you can find the adjective, because the adjective is answering a question about another word in the sentence, because it's further describing that other word. So if we look at tax right here, income is the adjective further describing tax, because this could be a sales tax or a gift tax. But in this case, it's an income tax. So income is the adjective. Let's take a look at another example. They are here for an annual meeting. So, quick side note. There are words called articles. An example of articles are a, an, and the. So those three words are articles. Articles are also adjectives. So anytime you see the words a, an, or the, they're called articles and they are adjectives. So if we look at this sentence, it says they are here for an annual meeting. So boom, right here we see an, which is an article. So it must be an adjective. So what is an describing? Is it describing annual? No, it's describing meeting, because we could take annual out and the sentence would say they are here for a meeting. So an must be describing meeting. Well, annual is also describing meeting, because how often does this meeting occur? What kind of meeting is this? It's an annual meeting. So an and annual are both adjectives describing meeting. And that leads me to another point. You can have more than one adjective in a sentence, and you could have more than one adjective next to each other. Like, look at that tall, blue-eyed man. Tall and blue-eyed are both adjectives, and they're both describing man, and they can be right next to each other. And sometimes you need to put a comma in between those two adjectives. But the main point I want you to get there is that two adjectives can be right next to each other, describing the same word. All right, let's look at another example, our last example. That is the right choice. So this one's a little bit harder than the other ones. But if you look at choice right here, okay, what word is describing choice? Right is describing choice, because this isn't talking about right or left. This is talking about correct or incorrect. So the author is saying that is the correct choice. Now, one last note about adjectives. Adjectives aren't always vital to a sentence. Like, you can remove them and the sentence still makes sense. So if we take income out of this sentence, you can read the sentence as, how much tax do you have to pay? That sentence still makes sense without the adjective. They are here for a meeting. So a lot of times you need articles in a sentence to still make sense. So if we leave annual or an in the sentence but take annual out, the sentence still makes sense as they are here for a meeting. In this sentence, if you were to remove right, the sentence wouldn't make as quite as much sense. It would say that is the choice, which by itself that sentence makes sense, but you don't understand anymore that that's a correct choice. So I hope you get my point from that, is that adjectives are important to a sentence because they give us a further description of another word in a sentence. But many times you can remove that adjective from the sentence and the sentence will still make sense. A preposition is basically a word that can't stand alone because it wouldn't make sense by itself. Some examples of a preposition would be in, under, or around. You notice these words can't stand by themselves because they don't make sense by themselves. There's not enough information there. So that's where the prepositional phrase comes into play. A prepositional phrase might look like in the tree or around the corner. So right here, in would be a preposition, and tree is what we call the object of the preposition. Because right here, if we just have the preposition in, we're wondering in what? It's in the tree. Or around the corner. Around is a preposition, and corner is the object of the preposition. We don't know what's around. It's around the corner. So prepositional phrases just come in sentences. oftentimes at the end of a sentence. So we could say, the squirrel is in the tree. Here again, in is the preposition, tree is the object of the preposition, and squirrel is the subject of the sentence. So if we just have the preposition, this kind of leaves us hanging. We're wondering the squirrel is in what? So tree is the object of the preposition because it tells where the squirrel, or what the squirrel is in. So there's lots of prepositions out there, way too many for me to name right now. But I'm going to teach you a trick to help you remember prepositions. All right, there's a tree I drew. That's about the best I can do. But think about a tree and a squirrel. Okay, think about all the things the squirrel can do when near a tree. And that'll help you remember prepositions. Because a squirrel could be under a tree, and under is a preposition. It could be in a tree, or around a tree, or upon a tree, or behind a tree, beside a tree, next to a tree, beneath a tree, over a tree, toward a tree, past a tree, or by a tree. So all those words I listed, by, past, toward, those are all prepositions. And so by remembering a squirrel and its relationship to a tree, it may seem kind of silly, but that can help you remember many of the prepositions.